Picture this. A German Tiger commander sits in what he believes is an invincible fortress on tracks, scanning the Italian countryside through his periscope, confident that nothing within 1,000 yards can touch him, when suddenly his entire world explodes from a direction he didn't think possible, and in the split second before everything goes dark, he realizes the war just changed and nobody told him. This is January 1944, and somewhere in a bunker hundreds of miles away, Adolf Hitler is about to receive a report that will shatter one of his favorite illusions, because the weapon his staff dismissed as a desperate Allied improvisation is now turning his prize Tigers into expensive coffins, and the soldiers pulling the triggers aren't even American, they're Canadian, which somehow makes it worse. If you think you know how technological superiority works in war, stay with me, because what happened when Canadian Fireflies started hunting? Tigers rewrote the rules, and the conversations happening behind closed doors in Berlin reveal something far more interesting than just tank-on-tank combat. Let me take you inside those rooms where Hitler's staff had to explain the unexplainable. The Sherman Firefly wasn't supposed to exist. Let's start there. Because in 1943, British tankers had a problem that kept them awake at night. They were climbing into machines that couldn't kill what they needed to kill. Standard Shermans with their 75mm guns could knock out most German armor, sure, but when a Tiger showed up, you had two choices, run or die, and running wasn't always an option. The British solution was beautifully desperate. Take the excellent British 17-pounder anti-tank gun, a weapon so powerful it could punch through nearly any German armor at range, and somehow cram it into a Sherman chassis that was never designed to hold it. The Americans thought this was insane. The gun was too big, the recoil too violent, the whole concept too risky. But the British did it anyway because desperation breeds innovation. And by early 1944, Canadian armored units were receiving these hybrid monsters. Now here's where it gets psychologically fascinating. The Germans knew the 17-pounder existed. Their intelligence reports mentioned it. Their officers had seen it in action as a towed anti-tank gun. But somewhere in the chain of assumptions that armies make during war, German High Command decided that mounting such a weapon in a tank turret was either impossible or impractical. So when Tiger commanders rolled into battle, they calculated threat ranges based on what they thought Shermans could do, which was hit hard at maybe 500 yards if you were lucky, maybe 800 if the stars aligned, but 800 yards. That wasn't even on the mental map, and this is the kind of error that kills people. The first engagements happened in Italy, because that's where Canadian units equipped with Fireflies first encountered heavy German armor in significant numbers. And imagine you're a Tiger crew. You've been told your frontal armor is effectively immune to Sherman fire at any combat range. You've seen standard Shermans bounce shots off your hull. You've developed this swagger that comes from technological advantage, and then from almost 2 kilometers away, further than you think a Sherman can even see you clearly, a round smashes through your armor like it's made of tin, and your tank is burning before you process what happened. The reports started flowing up the German chain of command almost immediately. Tigers destroyed at extreme range by what appeared to be standard Allied tanks. Crews who survived described impacts from angles and distances that shouldn't have been possible. And at first, German intelligence struggled to understand what they were seeing. Were the Allies using new ammunition? Had they developed a secret tank destroyer? Was this some kind of American superweapon they'd missed? The answer was both simpler and more embarrassing. The British had simply done what German engineers said couldn't be done, and Canadians were using it to devastating effect. Now let's talk about what happened in those staff meetings, because this is where the human drama gets rich. You have to understand that by 1944, Hitler's relationship with reality was already fracturing. He believed in German technical superiority the way some people believe in religion. It wasn't just doctrine, it was identity. And when his officers brought him evidence that Allied tanks were killing Tigers at ranges, the Tigers couldn't effectively return fire, his first instinct wasn't to adapt, it was to question the reports. Multiple sources confirmed that Hitler initially refused to believe Canadian Shermans could mount effective anti-tank guns. He demanded proof. He wanted to know if the crews were lying to cover their own failures. He suggested that perhaps the Tigers were being destroyed by hidden anti-tank guns and the Sherman story was Allied disinformation. Because accepting the truth meant accepting that German engineering supremacy was a myth, and myths die hard, especially when your entire propaganda machine runs on them. His staff had to walk a psychological tightrope. They needed to convince Hitler the threat was real, without making it sound like German tanks were suddenly obsolete, so they framed it carefully. They emphasized that this was a specific British modification, not a general Allied capability. They pointed out that standard Shermans were still vulnerable. They reassured him that Tigers remained superior in armor and firepower to most enemy tanks, but they couldn't escape the central problem. Canadian Fireflies were achieving kill ratios that shouldn't have been possible, and German armor doctrine had no answer for it. The tactical implications spread like a virus through German armored units, because once word got out that some Shermans could kill you from 1,800 yards, suddenly every Sherman was potentially lethal. Tiger commanders couldn't tell the difference between a standard Sherman and a Firefly at distance. The Firefly's longer barrel was visible if you knew what to look for, but in combat conditions, with dust and smoke and adrenaline, making that distinction was nearly impossible. So German tankers started treating every Sherman encounter as if it might be their last, which is exactly the kind of psychological warfare that breaks armies from the inside. The Canadians, meanwhile, developed tactics specifically designed to exploit this advantage. They would position Fireflies at extreme range, use standard Shermans as bait to draw Tigers into the open, and then hit them from angles the Germans didn't think they needed to guard. It was brilliant, ruthless, and it worked. The psychological impact on German crews was profound. Knowing that what you thought was safe distance might actually be a kill zone changes how you fight. It makes you hesitant. Defensive, reactive instead of proactive, and in armored warfare, hesitation is death. Here's something that rarely makes it into the history books but absolutely happened. German tank crews started refusing orders, not in some dramatic, mutinous way, but in subtle acts of self-preservation. Commanders who were told to advance would suddenly develop mechanical problems, units would report enemy positions that required different approach routes, experienced crews found ways to delay deployments until they had better intelligence about what they were facing, because nobody wanted to be the crew that got vaporized by a tank they thought was harmless. Back in Berlin, Hitler's response evolved through predictable stages, first denial, then anger, then bargaining. He wanted immediate solutions, he demanded new tactics, he ordered the development of even heavier tanks to restore German superiority. But here's the problem with dictatorships. Nobody wants to tell the leader that his solution won't work. So generals who knew that building heavier tanks would only create slower targets nodded and said yes. Engineers who understood that the Tiger's real weakness wasn't armor thickness, but tactical doctrine kept quiet, and the war machine ground on, making expensive mistakes because the truth was too dangerous to speak. The conversations we have records of are fascinating for what they reveal about leadership under pressure. In one documented exchange, a panzer general tried to explain to Hitler that the issue wasn't the Firefly's gun, but Allied production capacity. Germany could build better individual tanks, but the Allies could build more tanks faster, and when one gets destroyed, they simply bring up another. Hitler's response was to insist that quality would always triumph over quantity, which sounds inspiring until you're the crew of that one quality tank facing 5 adequate tanks with one really good gun. Then philosophy becomes irrelevant, and metal becomes everything. The Battle of Normandy turned this into a systematic problem, because suddenly German armor wasn't just facing isolated Canadian units, but entire Allied armored divisions that included Firefly-equipped squadrons, and the kill ratios started looking truly ugly. Tigers that were supposed to dominate the battlefield were being taken out at ranges where they couldn't effectively engage, and worse, the Allies had figured out that Fireflies were valuable enough to protect, so they stopped using them as frontline brawlers and started employing them as long-range snipers, which played perfectly to their strengths and minimized their weaknesses. German intelligence eventually figured out how to identify Fireflies. They noted the longer barrel. They tracked which Allied units had them. They developed specific tactics for dealing with them. But by then, the psychological damage was done. Every Sherman was Schrödinger's tank, potentially deadly until proven otherwise, and that uncertainty cost German armor its tactical initiative. Because when you're afraid of what might be out there, you stop hunting and start hiding. And armies that hide don't win wars. Hitler's staff tried various approaches to solve the Firefly problem. Some suggested concentrating artillery on suspected Firefly positions. Others recommended using long-range anti-tank guns to engage at even greater distances. A few brave souls suggested that maybe Germany should focus on defensive operations, where German guns could be pre-positioned. But Hitler wanted offensive solutions because defensive thinking was defeatist thinking. So the official response remained: build better tanks, fight harder, believe in victory. Which worked great as propaganda, but failed spectacularly as strategy. The human cost of this institutional blindness is where the story gets truly dark. Because while Hitler and his staff argued about doctrine, actual human beings were climbing into tigers thinking they were safe, rolling into positions thinking they had range advantage, and discovering too late that the rules had changed. And here's the thing about being in a burning tank. You have about 15 seconds to get out if the ammunition doesn't cook off, which means 15 seconds to process that your government lied to you, your training failed you, and your technological superiority was a fairy tale. That's a hard 15 seconds. Canadian crews, for their part, developed their own psychological relationship with the Firefly. It was powerful, but it was also a target. German forces learned to prioritize killing Fireflies, so crews knew that every engagement might be their last. They dealt with this through dark humor and meticulous professionalism. They named their tanks things like bad medicine and knockout. They developed almost superstitious rituals around maintenance and positioning, because when you're wielding lightning, you want to make sure it strikes the other guy first. The broader strategic implication was that Hitler's armor doctrine, which relied heavily on qualitative superiority and crew training, started collapsing in the face of Allied quantitative advantages, backed by occasional qualitative parity. The Firefly wasn't better than a Tiger in every way. It was worse in armor and mechanical reliability. But it was good enough in the one metric that mattered most. Could it kill the enemy before the enemy killed it? And at boned 800 yards, the answer was yes, which made all the other metrics interesting but irrelevant. What Hitler's staff told him, when they finally couldn't avoid the truth anymore, was this: the Allies have developed a weapon system that negates our armor advantage in specific circumstances. Our crews are experiencing morale problems because their confidence in equipment superiority has been shaken. Our tactical doctrine needs immediate revision, and our production priorities might be fundamentally wrong. But they told him this in the most careful language possible, wrapped in reassurances and alternative plans, because telling Hitler he was wrong about something he'd publicly championed was career suicide and possibly actual suicide. So the truth came out in whispers and careful phrasings and reports buried in technical details. The really tragic part is that Germany had the engineering capability to respond effectively. They could have developed new tactics, redistributed their armor assets, focused on defensive operations that played to their remaining strengths. But institutional pride and ideological rigidity prevented adaptation. Hitler wanted solutions that confirmed his worldview, not solutions that worked. And an army that fights to confirm its leader's ego rather than achieve victory is an army that's already lost. It just doesn't know it yet. By late 1944, the Firefly had become something like a ghost story in German armored units, exaggerated in some tellings, downplayed in official reports, but always there in the background of tactical planning. Commanders who'd never seen one still planned around them. Crews who'd survived encounters told stories that got wilder with each retelling. And the weapon that wasn't supposed to exist became the thing that German tankers feared most, which is a special kind of psychological defeat, being scared of your enemy's improvisation. The Canadians who operated Fireflies had mixed feelings about their reputation. On one hand, being feared is useful. It makes the enemy hesitant. But on the other hand, it made them priority targets. German forces would throw everything at a suspected Firefly position, and being the target of that kind of focused violence is exhausting. So Firefly crews developed elaborate camouflage techniques. They would disguise their longer barrels, park behind standard Shermans, use terrain to hide their silhouettes. Anything to survive long enough to take the first shot, because in tank combat, first shot advantage is everything. Hitler never fully accepted that the Firefly represented a failure of German intelligence and doctrine. Even in his final months, he clung to narratives about German technical superiority. He blamed losses on crew failures, on numerical disadvantages, on betrayal by subordinates, but never on the possibility that German assumptions might have been wrong from the start. And this is the pattern of failed leadership across history. Reality bends to accommodate ego until reality stops bending and everything breaks. The staff officers who survived the war and talked about these briefings described a surreal atmosphere. They were trying to fight a modern mechanized war using 19th century command structures and medieval notions of glory. Hitler would demand impossible victories. They would nod and say yes, then go back to their offices and try to figure out how to minimize the inevitable disaster. It was strategic theater, everyone playing their role, nobody believing the lines anymore. But the performance continued because stopping meant admitting it was all pointless, and that admission was psychologically unbearable. Some historians argue that the Firefly's real impact wasn't the Tigers it destroyed, but the tactical initiative it stripped from German armor, because once Tiger commanders couldn't rely on range advantage, they lost their primary tactical tool. They became reactive, waiting for the enemy to make mistakes rather than forcing mistakes through aggressive maneuvering, and reactive armies don't win battles, they just delay defeats, which is exactly what happened across northwestern Europe in 1944 and 1945. German armor fought brilliant defensive actions that ultimately meant nothing, because defense without counterattack is just slow surrender. The Canadian perspective on all this is interesting, because Canada entered the war as a relatively minor military power and emerged with some of the most feared armored units in Europe. The crews who operated Fireflies weren't superhuman. They were farmers and clerks and factory workers who learned to kill efficiently because the alternative was being killed, and they carried that knowledge home with them after the war, which created its own kind of psychological burden. Because how do you go back to normal life after you've mastered the art of burning strangers alive at 1-800 yards? The answer is, you don't, not really. You learn to live with it, but it never fully leaves you. What Hitler's staff should have told him but never could was this: we lost the armor war the moment we started believing our own propaganda. The Tiger was a magnificent machine, but it was also a resource trap, expensive to build, difficult to maintain, impossible to replace quickly, and vulnerable to the same tactical mistakes as any other tank. The Allies didn't beat us with better technology. They beat us with better logistics, more flexibility, and willingness to accept losses that would have been politically unacceptable in Germany. They could afford to lose 3 Shermans to kill 1 Tiger because they had 10 more Shermans waiting, and we had no more Tigers. But saying this would have required Hitler to confront the fundamental unsustainability of his war strategy, and that conversation was never going to happen. The Firefly story is ultimately about what happens when institutional arrogance meets battlefield reality. The Germans assumed they controlled the technological narrative. They thought their engineering superiority was permanent and insurmountable. They built doctrine around assumptions that felt true but weren't. And when a scrappy Allied improvisation shattered those assumptions, the German military-industrial complex was too rigid to adapt quickly, too proud to admit error, too committed to existing solutions to imagine new ones, and this rigidity cost them battles, campaigns, and ultimately the war. Because wars aren't won by the side with the best equipment. They're won by the side that adapts fastest to changing conditions. For the Canadian Firefly crews, the legacy is complicated. They accomplished something extraordinary with inadequate resources and improvised tactics. They took a weapon their own allies thought was barely functional and turned it into a tiger killer that haunted German nightmares. But the cost was measured in friends who didn't come back, in screaming metal and burning fuel, in memories that wouldn't fade and wounds that wouldn't heal. And when they came home, nobody really wanted to hear about 1-800-yard kills and exploding tigers. People wanted stories about liberation and heroism, not the messy truth of industrial-scale killing, so most of them stayed quiet and let the stories fade, which is its own kind of tragedy. The tactical lessons from the Firefly versus Tiger matchup are still studied in military academies today, because they illustrate fundamental principles that transcend specific weapons systems. Perception shapes behavior, uncertainty creates hesitation, and the enemy who controls the engagement range often controls the outcome. Modern tank doctrine still incorporates ideas that Canadian Firefly crews figured out through trial and error in 1944, which means that every time a modern tanker talks about standoff engagement or long-range precision fires, they're echoing tactical innovations born from desperation on Italian hillsides and Norman hedgerows. If you've made it this far, you're probably wondering why this story matters beyond military history nerds and tank enthusiasts, and here's why. It's a perfect example of how institutional blindness works, how organizations convince themselves they're invincible right up until the moment they're not, how leaders can be so invested in their own narratives that they refuse to see contradictory evidence, and how the people at the bottom, the ones actually doing the fighting and dying, always know the truth before the people at the top admit it. This pattern repeats across history, in businesses, governments, militaries, any hierarchy where ego matters more than reality, and understanding it might help us recognize it when it happens again, because it always happens again. The conversations in Hitler's bunker about Canadian Fireflies were never really about tanks. They were about control, about maintaining the illusion of superiority even as the foundation crumbled, about choosing comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths, and about the catastrophic consequences when leaders prioritize their own psychological needs over strategic reality. Those conversations shaped decisions that killed thousands of people on both sides, not because anyone was stupid or evil necessarily, but because the system rewarded denial and punished honesty. And once you build that kind of system, it's almost impossible to dismantle before it destroys itself. So what actually happened when Hitler's staff told him about Canadian Fireflies killing tigers at 1-800 yards? They told him it was a temporary setback. They assured him German engineering would prevail. They promised new weapons were coming. They blamed everything except the fundamental flaws in German armor doctrine. And Hitler believed them because he wanted to believe them, because the alternative was admitting that the war was already lost and had been for a while. And that admission would have required a different kind of courage than the courage to keep fighting. It would have required the courage to accept failure, and neither Hitler nor his staff had that courage. So the war ground on, tigers kept burning, Firefly crews kept pulling triggers, and history kept moving toward its inevitable conclusion. The question I'll leave you with is this: how many times do we repeat this pattern in our own lives and organizations, refusing to see what's clearly visible because seeing it would require changing our self-image? And how much does that refusal cost us before we finally accept reality and adapt? Think about it, because the line between a German officer in 1944 refusing to admit his tanks are vulnerable and a modern executive refusing to admit his business model is failing is thinner than we'd like to believe. The specific details change, but the psychological dynamics remain constant, which is why history doesn't repeat, but it definitely rhymes. If this story grabbed you, if you're starting to see the psychological patterns beneath the tactical details, there's more where this came from. More stories about the moments when certainty collapsed and reality intruded. More deep dives into the conversations that shaped history, the decisions made under pressure, the costs of institutional pride. Stick around, because understanding how we got here is the only way to figure out where we're going. And sometimes the truth hiding in 70-year-old staff meetings says more about human nature than anything we could learn from a textbook. The subscribe button is right there if you want to keep exploring these stories together. Now let's talk about what happened after those initial reports reached Berlin. Because the story of how German armored doctrine unraveled doesn't end with Hitler's denial. It accelerates into something far more desperate and psychologically devastating. And if you thought the first encounters were bad, wait until you see what happened when both sides fully understood the rules of this new game. The Canadians didn't just stumble into Firefly tactics, they systematically developed a killing methodology that turned tank warfare into something closer to surgical strikes. And the genius of it was that they understood psychology as well as ballistics. They knew that a Tiger crew's confidence was a weapon they could exploit, so they designed engagements specifically to shatter that confidence, and it worked better than anyone expected. Here's what a typical Canadian Firefly ambush looked like by mid-1944. And pay attention, because this is where battlefield tactics become psychological warfare. You position your Firefly in a concealed spot with clear sight lines at extreme range. You send standard Shermans forward to draw out German armor. The Tiger commander sees what he thinks are vulnerable targets and moves to engage. He's calculating based on the assumption that he's safe at 1,500 yards, that he has time to position and fire, and then your Firefly puts a 17-pounder round through his frontal armor from an angle he didn't think needed watching, and before his wingman can react, you've displaced, and the second Tiger is trying to figure out where death came from. This isn't just tactics. This is theater designed to create maximum psychological impact. German tankers started developing what modern psychologists would call hypervigilance, a state of constant tension where you're scanning for threats that might not exist but could kill you instantly if they do. And here's the problem with hypervigilance. It's exhausting. It degrades decision-making. It makes you see threats that aren't there while missing threats that are. Tiger crews were reporting Fireflies in positions where no Firefly existed, calling in artillery on suspected positions that turned out to be empty. And this paranoia was exactly what Canadian commanders wanted, because a scared enemy is a predictable enemy. The German response evolved through several phases, and each one reveals something fascinating about institutional thinking under pressure. Phase 1 was denial, we covered that. Phase 2 was tactical adjustment. German armor started traveling in larger groups. They increased spacing between vehicles to prevent multiple kills from a single position. They demanded better reconnaissance before advancing. All reasonable responses, except they slowed German armor to a crawl and turned aggressive panzer tactics into cautious defensive maneuvers, which played perfectly into Allied hands because the Allies didn't need to win tank duels. They just needed to keep moving forward. And slow German tanks defending positions were still losing positions, just taking longer to die. Phase 3 of the German response is where it gets really interesting, because this is when Berlin started demanding technological solutions to tactical problems. Hitler ordered the development of longer-range guns for the Tiger. He wanted better optics, improved targeting systems, anything that would restore the range advantage German crews thought they had. But here's the engineering reality that nobody wanted to tell him. The Tiger was already at the limits of what its chassis and turret could handle. You can't just bolt on a bigger gun without reinforcing everything else, and reinforcing everything else means more weight, which means slower speed, which means easier targets. It's a vicious cycle where every solution creates new problems, but German engineers were ordered to solve it anyway, so they built prototypes and test systems and wrote optimistic reports while knowing none of it would arrive in time to matter. Meanwhile, Canadian Firefly crews were learning their own lessons, and not all of them were victories. German forces adapted by using artillery more aggressively. If they suspected a Firefly position, they'd saturate it with shells. They started using scout units to deliberately trigger Firefly crews into revealing positions. They developed their own version of the bait and ambush tactic, and Firefly losses started climbing, because here's the thing about being the weapon everyone fears. You become the target. Everyone focuses on killing, and no amount of armor makes you immortal when the enemy knows you're worth 3 times the effort to destroy. The psychological burden on Firefly crews was immense and rarely discussed in official histories. These men knew they were operating the single most valuable and vulnerable tank in any engagement. They knew German forces were actively hunting them. They knew that if they missed their first shot, they might not get a second one. And they had to live with this knowledge while climbing into their tank every morning. Some crews handled it through dark humor, others through superstition, a few through the kind of focused professionalism that looks like calm but is really controlled terror. And the ones who couldn't handle it either requested transfers or made mistakes, and mistakes in a Firefly usually meant death, so the survivors were the ones who learned to function with permanent fear as their baseline. The battles in Normandy's Bocage country turned this into an even more complex chess game, because now you had optimal ambush terrain on both sides, hedgerows that could hide entire tank platoons, narrow lanes that channeled movement into kill zones, farms and villages that provided hard cover. And in this environment, the Firefly's range advantage mattered less because engagements happened at closer distances, so Canadian crews had to adapt again, developing techniques for urban and close-terrain fighting, where their guns' power mattered more than its range, and they got good at it, scarily good, to the point where German infantry started requesting that armor avoid certain areas where Canadian Fireflies were known to operate. which is a special kind of defeat when your own side would rather you didn't help. Hitler's staff continued their impossible task of reporting battlefield reality while maintaining the Führer's belief in inevitable victory. And the transcripts of some of these briefings read like absurdist theater. You have generals explaining that the Tiger remains the superior tank, while simultaneously reporting increasing Tiger losses. You have intelligence officers describing Allied tank capabilities while insisting German armor doctrine is fundamentally sound. You have logistics experts explaining why they can't replace destroyed Tigers as fast as they're being lost. While promising that production will increase any day now, everyone's telling contradictory truths simultaneously because the alternative is being blamed for defeatism. And the result is strategic paralysis wrapped in bureaucratic language. The really devastating reports came from German officers who'd been captured and interrogated because they had nothing left to lose by telling the truth. Allied intelligence got detailed descriptions of German morale problems, tactical confusion, crew refusals, mechanical breakdowns being used as excuses to avoid combat. And the picture that emerged was of an armored force in psychological collapse, not because they'd been physically defeated in every engagement, but because they'd lost confidence in their equipment, their doctrine, and their leadership. And an army without confidence is just a collection of people waiting to go home. Canadian units developed reputations that transcended the Firefly specifically. German forces started treating all Canadian armor with extreme caution because they couldn't risk assuming anything was a soft target. This created a force multiplication effect where even standard Canadian Sherman units got more tactical space and respect than equivalent American or British units. And the Canadians used this psychological advantage ruthlessly. They'd send scouts forward knowing German forces would overestimate their strength. They'd feint with small units to pin down larger German formations. They turned their reputation into a weapon as valuable as the Firefly itself. The human cost of these engagements is worth examining because the statistics hide individual tragedies. Every Tiger killed at 1,800 yards was 5 German boys who burned or suffocated or got torn apart by metal. Every Firefly destroyed in a counterattack was 4 or 5 Canadian boys who died the same way. And the really dark part is that both sides knew exactly what would happen in these engagements. There was no mystery about what a penetrating tank round does to human bodies. Everyone had seen it, smelled it, heard the screams, and they kept climbing into tanks anyway because the alternative was worse. Either you'd be shot for desertion, or you'd watch your friends die while you stayed safe. So you climbed in, and you hoped today wasn't your day. And you tried not to think about what happened to the crews who guessed wrong. The technical evolution of both sides' tactics reveals how adaptive humans can be under existential pressure. Germans started using smoke more effectively to break sight lines. They developed better camouflage techniques for Tigers. They positioned anti-tank guns to cover suspected Firefly positions, and some of this worked, but it was all reactive, all defensive, all designed to minimize losses rather than achieve objectives. And you can't win wars by minimizing losses. You win by accomplishing missions, and German armor increasingly couldn't accomplish missions because they were too busy trying not to die. Canadian Firefly crews, meanwhile, were sharing lessons across units with remarkable speed. They developed informal networks where experienced crews would teach new crews the tricks that kept you alive. Things like never firing from the same position twice, always having an escape route planned before engaging, using terrain to limit your exposure while maximizing your field of fire. And this knowledge sharing created a learning curve that accelerated over time. Early Firefly crews had to figure everything out through trial and error. Later, crews inherited accumulated wisdom, which meant they survived longer and learned faster, which meant the Canadians were improving while the Germans were stagnating, and that gap determined outcomes. The strategic implications finally hit German high command around late summer 1944, when they had to acknowledge that armor operations in Normandy were failing, not because of inferior numbers or tactics, but because German crews no longer believed they could win armored engagements. And belief matters in combat more than most people realize. Soldiers who think they're going to lose fight differently than soldiers who think they're going to win. They're more hesitant, more defensive, quicker to retreat. And these behavioral changes compound until you have an army that's defeated itself psychologically before the first shot is fired. Hitler's response to these reports was to double down on his existing beliefs. He ordered new tank designs that were even heavier, even more heavily armored, even more complex. The result was machines like the Jagdtiger and Maus that were engineering marvels and tactical disasters, too heavy to cross most bridges, too mechanically complex to maintain in field conditions, too slow to maneuver effectively. They represented everything wrong with German armor philosophy in 1944, the belief that technical perfection could overcome strategic reality. And when these machines rolled out, they impressed everyone who saw them and accomplished almost nothing because they couldn't get to the places they were needed in time to matter. The Canadians, for their part, never got complacent about the Fireflies' advantages. They knew that German intelligence would eventually develop reliable identification methods, that countermeasures would improve, that their tactical edge would erode over time, so they kept innovating. They started using Fireflies in pairs to provide mutual cover. They developed hand signals for coordinating engagements without radio traffic that German units could intercept. They trained crews to fire and displace in under 30 seconds, and this constant evolution kept them ahead of German adaptation cycles. One particularly brutal engagement that doesn't get enough historical attention happened near Falaise, where a Canadian Firefly platoon encountered an entire German tank company in an open field. And by every conventional measure, this should have been a German victory. They had numerical advantage. They had Tigers. They had the defensive position. But the Canadian crews executed their ambush perfectly. They used a slight ridgeline to hide their hulls, while exposing just enough turret to fire. They coordinated their shots to hit multiple targets simultaneously, so German crews couldn't identify where fire was coming from. And in less than 5 minutes, they destroyed 7 German tanks, while taking only 1 loss. And the surviving German tanks retreated, not because they were out of ammunition or tactically defeated, but because their commanders couldn't handle the psychological pressure of watching their unit evaporate from invisible threats. The reports from German survivors of that engagement are psychologically revealing. They describe feeling helpless, outmatched and betrayed by their equipment. They talk about how the myths they'd been told about Tiger superiority crumbled in real time. And several mentioned that after that battle they never felt safe in a tank again, which is exactly the kind of psychological casualty that doesn't show up in official statistics, but determines war outcomes. Because an army of traumatized soldiers stops being an army and becomes a mob waiting for permission to run. Hitler's staff, by this point, had largely given up trying to make him understand the reality of armored warfare. They would deliver their reports, he would respond with impossible demands. They would say yes and then go do whatever they thought might actually work, which created a bifurcated German military, where official policy bore no relationship to actual operations. Commanders in the field were making tactical decisions based on reality, while headquarters was making strategic decisions based on fantasy. And the disconnect between these two realities meant German forces were often fighting without coherent overall direction. The Firefly's reputation grew to almost mythical proportions on both sides. Germans exaggerated its capabilities, claiming it could penetrate any German armor at any range, which wasn't true but served Allied purposes by making German crews even more paranoid. Canadians underplayed its vulnerabilities, emphasizing successes while quietly dealing with mechanical issues and crew losses. And somewhere between these two distorted narratives was the actual weapon. A powerful but imperfect machine operated by scared but competent humans trying to kill each other efficiently. By the time the war ended, Firefly crews had destroyed hundreds of German tanks at ranges German doctrine said was impossible, and the psychological impact of this extended far beyond the destroyed vehicles. It shattered German confidence in their armored doctrine, revealed the limitations of Hitler's leadership, accelerated the collapse of German defensive operations in Western Europe, and established Canadian armored units as elite forces. But if you ask the crews who operated these machines, most will tell you it wasn't about tactics or technology. It was about fear management, about doing your job while knowing you could die any second, about trusting your crew and hoping luck stayed on your side. And that's the human reality beneath the technical discussion. The legacy of what happened when Canadian Fireflies started killing Tigers at 1,800 yards is that it proved something military theorists had long suspected but rarely seen demonstrated so clearly. Technological advantage is temporary, psychological advantage is decisive. The side that adapts faster wins regardless of equipment quality, and leadership that can't accept uncomfortable truths will always lose to leadership that can. These lessons were learned at the cost of thousands of lives on both sides, paid for in burning metal, and screaming boys and families that received telegrams instead of sons, and forgetting those lessons dishonors everyone who paid that price. What Hitler's staff finally admitted to each other in private, after the war was clearly lost, was that they'd known the armor war was unwinnable by mid-1944. They'd seen the production numbers. They understood the tactical realities. They knew Allied advantages in logistics and adaptability would eventually overwhelm German technical sophistication. But they couldn't say this to Hitler because Hitler didn't want solutions. He wanted validation. And an organization that prioritizes validation over truth is an organization in its death spiral, circling faster and faster until it hits the ground. If you're still here, if this story is resonating beyond just military history, it's because you're recognizing the pattern. You've seen organizations that couldn't adapt, leaders who couldn't accept reality, systems that valued ego over effectiveness. And maybe you're wondering how to avoid being on the wrong side of that equation when it happens in your life. Because it will happen. The question is whether you'll be the person who sees reality clearly or the person who maintains comfortable delusions until reality makes the choice for you. The Canadian crews who survived the war carried these experiences home with them. Most didn't talk about it. How do you explain to civilians what it feels like to kill someone from 2,800 yards away? To watch their tank brew up and know you just burned 5 people alive? To do this repeatedly until it becomes routine? To come home and be expected to return to normal as if you hadn't spent months becoming an expert at industrial-scale killing? You don't explain it. You bury it. You have nightmares. You jump at loud noises. You struggle with intimacy. Because letting people get close means they might die, and you've seen too much death already, and society calls this heroism, but really it's just damage that we dress up in medals because acknowledging the actual cost would be too uncomfortable. The Firefly story matters today because the same dynamics play out continuously in different contexts. Organizations that refuse to see threatening changes until it's too late, leaders who prioritize their ego over effectiveness, systems that reward denial and punish truth-telling, and the result is always the same: unnecessary suffering, preventable failures, and eventual collapse. The specific details change, but the pattern remains constant, because human psychology hasn't evolved much in the last 80 years. So here's the final question, and I want you to really think about it. When you're in an organization that's refusing to adapt to obvious threats, when leadership is making decisions based on how they want the world to be rather than how it actually is, when speaking truth becomes career suicide, and maintaining comfortable lies becomes organizational culture, what do? Do you speak up knowing you'll be punished? Do you stay quiet and watch the disaster unfold? Do you leave and save yourself while others suffer? There's no easy answer because any choice has consequences. And maybe that's the real lesson from what happened when Hitler's staff had to explain why Canadian Fireflies were killing tigers at impossible ranges. Sometimes you're in a situation where all your options are bad, and you just have to choose the option you can live with afterward. And that choice defines you more than any tactical victory or technological advantage ever could. The crews who operated these weapons on both sides were mostly just trying to survive while doing their duty. They didn't make the strategic decisions, they didn't choose the wars, they just showed up and did what they were trained to do and hoped they'd live long enough to go home. And most of them did go home, but home was never the same because they weren't the same. And maybe that's the real cost of institutional failure at the top. It's paid by the people at the bottom who never had a choice in the matter, who trusted that their leaders knew what they were doing, who believed the equipment would protect them, who thought the doctrine was sound, and who learned too late that all of it was built on assumptions that reality didn't respect. If this extended look into the psychology behind the tactics, the human cost behind the statistics, the institutional failures behind the battlefield defeats, has given you a different perspective on how wars are really won and lost, there's value in exploring more of these stories because history is full of moments where the official narrative and the actual truth diverged dramatically, where what we were told happened and what actually happened were two different things. And understanding the gap between them is how we avoid repeating the same mistakes in new contexts. So if you want to keep digging into these hidden truths and uncomfortable realities, you know where to find more. Let's go deeper into what happened after the shooting stopped, because the story of Canadian Fireflies versus German Tigers doesn't end with destroyed metal and battlefield victories. It continues in hospital wards and military tribunals and quiet rooms where men tried to process what they'd done and seen. And this is where the real cost becomes visible, not in statistics but in shattered psyches and broken families, and a generation that came home physically but never really left the war. The German tank crews who survived encounters with Fireflies carried a specific kind of trauma that medical officers at the time didn't have language to describe. They'd been told they were operating invincible machines. They'd built their identity around technical superiority, and then reality shattered that identity in seconds. Imagine spending months training on a weapon system you're told is unbeatable, developing confidence that borders on arrogance, and then watching your entire unit burn because someone with a supposedly inferior weapon understood angles and distance better than you did. That kind of cognitive dissonance doesn't just fade, it rewires how you see the world. There were documented cases of German Tiger commanders who survived Firefly attacks refusing to enter tanks afterward, not because they were cowards, but because their nervous systems had learned that tanks meant death, and no amount of rational argument could override that somatic response. The military called this cowardice and treated it with punishment. Modern psychology calls it trauma and treats it with therapy. But in 1944, there was no therapy, just shame and reassignment, and the understanding that you'd failed some unspoken test of masculinity. The Canadian crews who operated Fireflies developed their own psychological scars, different but equally deep. They'd become exceptionally good at killing people from distances where the enemy couldn't kill them back, which sounds like an advantage, and it was tactically, but psychologically, it created a disturbing dynamic. You couldn't claim self-defense in the immediate sense, because you were shooting people who didn't even know you were there. You were the aggressor in each engagement, even if strategically you were defending against invasion. And that distinction mattered to some crews, the ones who lay awake at night seeing the faces they'd never actually seen, imagining the families of men they'd killed with mathematical precision. One Firefly commander wrote in his diary, and this didn't come out until decades later, that he felt like a sniper in a tank, that he'd killed more men than he could count, but had never looked one in the eye. And he wondered if that made it better or worse, if distance absolved you or damned you, and he never found an answer that satisfied him. He just learned to live with the question, which is maybe all any of us can do when we're forced into moral complexity that has no clean resolution. The immediate post-war period saw both sides trying to process what had happened from strategic and tactical perspectives. German military analysts, the ones who survived and weren't prosecuted, wrote extensive after-action reports trying to understand where their armor doctrine failed. And what's fascinating is how many of them still couldn't fully admit the core problem. They'd write about numerical disadvantages, about Allied air superiority, about logistics failures, and these were all factors. But buried in footnotes and subordinate clauses was the admission that they'd overestimated their own capabilities and underestimated Allied adaptability. And this inability to state the truth clearly, even after defeat, shows how deeply institutional pride was embedded in German military culture. The Canadians, meanwhile, were being celebrated as heroes, which they were in the conventional sense. They'd fought bravely and effectively and helped win the war, but many of them felt disconnected from the celebrations because civilian society wanted simple narratives about good defeating evil. And what the Firefly crews had experienced was anything but simple. They'd participated in industrial killing that was morally necessary but emotionally devastating. They'd done terrible things for good reasons, and there's no medal that makes that contradiction comfortable to live with. Allied military analysts studied the Firefly versus Tiger engagements extensively because they revealed principles that would shape armored doctrine for decades. The importance of the first shot kill, the value of standoff engagement, the psychological impact of range advantage, the necessity of combined arms operations, But what these sterile analyses missed was the human dimension, the fact that doctrine is executed by terrified 19-year-olds who just want to survive, and any doctrine that doesn't account for human psychology under stress is just theory waiting to fail in contact with reality. There were specific engagements that became legendary among the crews who fought them, but never made it into official histories because they didn't fit neat narratives, like the battle near Caen, where a single Canadian Firefly held off an entire German tank company for 40 minutes by constantly repositioning and using terrain brilliantly. The commander kept his crew alive through a combination of tactical genius and sheer audacity. And when reinforcements finally arrived, they found him sitting on his tank smoking a cigarette with hands that shook so badly he could barely hold it. He'd killed 11 tanks that afternoon and probably saved hundreds of Allied lives. And he never spoke about it again, just requested transfer to a non-combat role and disappeared from the historical record. Or the German Tiger ace who survived 3 separate Firefly ambushes through a combination of skill, luck, and what his crew called supernatural awareness. He claimed he could feel when a Firefly was nearby, that there was a quality to the silence that was different, and whether this was genuine intuition or retrospective mythology doesn't matter, because his crew believed it, and that belief kept them hyper-alert and probably alive. He survived the war and became a successful businessman, and never told his children what he'd done, because how do you explain that your business success was built on skills learned while trying not to die in a burning metal box? The technological legacy of the Firefly is straightforward. It proved that gun caliber and crew training could overcome armor thickness at sufficient range. This principle influenced post-war tank design across every major military. The Cold War arms race in tank guns was essentially countries trying to build better Fireflies, longer range, higher penetration, faster targeting, all trying to achieve first-shot kills at maximum distance. And if you look at modern main battle tanks, they're basically Firefly philosophy taken to its logical extreme. But the human legacy is more complex and harder to measure. Veterans organizations in Canada tried to create support networks for Firefly crews specifically because they recognized these men had experienced something psychologically unique. But most of the crews didn't participate. They'd made their peace privately, or hadn't made peace at all. And they didn't see value in talking about it with other men who already knew. There was a kind of unspoken code. We did what we had to do. It's over now. Let's try to be normal. Except normal was impossible for most of them. And they knew it. So they constructed elaborate facades of normalcy while privately struggling with depression, anxiety, rage, all the symptoms we now recognize as PTSD, but they just called weakness. The German veterans faced different challenges because their society was dealing with collective guilt and defeat. Tiger commanders who'd been celebrated as heroes during the war became embarrassments after, symbols of a regime everyone wanted to forget, so they couldn't talk about their experiences even if they wanted to. There was no social space for, "I was good at my job and my job was fighting for Hitler." That sentence ends careers and relationships. So they stayed silent, and the knowledge of what it felt like to lose armored engagements to supposedly inferior opponents died with them. Except it didn't die. It leaked out in divorce rates and suicide rates and drinking problems, in sons who wondered why their fathers had such terrible nightmares and daughters who learned not to slam doors because loud noises made dad hit the floor. There's a documented meeting in 1947 between a Canadian Firefly commander and a German Tiger commander. They met by accident at a military conference, recognized each other from unit markings and battle descriptions, and spent an evening drinking and comparing notes, and the Canadian later wrote that it was the most honest conversation he'd had about the war because the German understood things other people couldn't. They'd both lived in that space where death was mathematical and constant, where good decisions meant you survived and bad decisions meant you burned. And that shared understanding created a bond that transcended the fact that they'd spent months trying to kill each other, which tells you something about how combat trauma works. Sometimes the enemy understands you better than your own family because they've been in the same hell. The tactical innovations developed by Firefly crews influenced more than just tank doctrine. Special operations units studied their ambush techniques, artillery units adopted their displacement procedures, infantry learned from their combined arms integration, And the cumulative effect was a transformation in how Western militaries thought about violence, away from mass charges and toward precision strikes, away from attrition and toward maneuver, away from courage as primary virtue and toward effectiveness as primary virtue. And this shift was largely driven by lessons learned from young men who figured out how to kill efficiently because the alternative was dying inefficiently. Hitler's staff in their final days, the ones who survived him, gave interviews and wrote memoirs trying to explain what had gone wrong, and it's striking how many of them focused on the armor war as a turning point. They'd point to Firefly engagements as moments when they knew the war was lost even if they couldn't admit it at the time. Because if your best weapons operated by your best crews, following your best doctrine, couldn't win against Allied improvisation, what did that say about German military supremacy? The answer was that supremacy was a myth that reality had disproven. But saying that in 1944 would have been treason, and saying it after the war was just embarrassing, so they wrapped it in technical language and blamed Hitler and moved on. Which is how institutional failure always works. The people who enabled it write history emphasizing their limited agency while minimizing their actual choices. The families of men who died in tigers destroyed by fireflies received letters that were masterpieces of bureaucratic evasion. Your son died heroically for the fatherland. No mention that he died in a trap created by German overconfidence. No acknowledgement that his death might have been prevented by better intelligence or more realistic doctrine. Just the standard language of noble sacrifice. And these families had to accept that narrative because questioning it meant confronting the possibility that their son died for mistakes rather than ideals, and that confrontation was psychologically unbearable for most people. Canadian families received similar letters with different language. Your son served with distinction. He helped liberate Europe, all true but incomplete, because they didn't mention the nightmares he'd have if he made it home, the drinking problem he'd developed trying to quiet the memories, the marriage that would fail because he couldn't be intimate with someone who hadn't seen what he'd seen, the slow collapse of the hero into an ordinary broken man. That trajectory was predictable for anyone who understood combat trauma, but society wasn't ready to acknowledge it, so we celebrated them and ignored their suffering and called it honor. The technological arms race the Firefly helped trigger had implications that extended far beyond World War II. The principle that gun beats armor at sufficient range drove tank development through the Cold War, which drove armor development, which drove anti-tank weapon development. An endless cycle of measure and countermeasure that consumed billions of dollars and produced weapons of increasing lethality. And you can trace this directly back to those first encounters where Canadian crews proved that innovative gunnery could overcome superior armor. They didn't intend to start an arms race. They were just trying to survive. But survival tactics became doctrine, and doctrine became strategy, and strategy shaped half a century of military development. The human cost of this arms race is rarely calculated, but it's substantial. Every dollar spent on better tank guns was a dollar not spent on schools or hospitals. Every engineer designing penetrators was an engineer not designing infrastructure. And the opportunity cost of preparing for armored warfare that mostly never happened shaped societies in ways we're still dealing with. And this connects back to that initial question of what Hitler's staff should have told him. They should have said that preparing to win the last war guaranteed losing the next one. But that truth was too threatening to the entire German military-industrial complex, so instead they built bigger tanks that solved yesterday's problems while creating tomorrow's disasters. Some Firefly crews maintained contact after the war, informal networks of men who'd served together, and their reunions were apparently both joyful and deeply sad. Joyful because they'd survived when so many hadn't. Sad because they were reminded of who they'd been before the war and how different they were now. One veteran described it as feeling like he'd died in France, but his body kept walking around for decades pretending to be alive. That might sound melodramatic, but it captures something true about combat trauma. You can survive physically while dying psychologically, and society doesn't know what to do with people in that liminal state. The German veterans had no equivalent networks because their war was unspeakable in post-war Germany. You couldn't gather publicly to reminisce about fighting for the Third Reich, so they stayed isolated with their memories, and isolation amplifies trauma without community to contextualize and process experience. it festers, which probably contributed to the high rates of untreated mental illness among German veterans. But again, this wasn't discussed publicly, because acknowledging it would have required acknowledging the human cost of the war Germany started, and that acknowledgement was too painful for a society trying to rebuild its identity. Modern armor crews study Firefly tactics as historical case studies. They watch recreations and analyze decisions and learn from successes and failures. But what they can't learn from historical analysis is what it felt like. The smell of burning rubber and flesh, the sound of metal tearing, the sight of men you trained with reduced to carbon, the weight of knowing you caused that and would cause it again tomorrow if ordered. That knowledge is experiential. It can't be taught. It can only be endured, and every generation of armor crews has to learn it fresh, which is maybe the real tragedy. We can transmit tactical knowledge across generations, but not wisdom about violence, so each war restarts the learning process from zero. The question of whether the Firefly crews were right to feel proud of their accomplishments is more complex than it seems. They were extraordinarily effective at their job. They helped win a war against genuine evil. They saved Allied lives through their skill. All of this is true and worth honoring. But they also became very good at killing people, and that skill came with moral weight whether they wanted it or not. Some crews resolved this by focusing on the righteousness of the cause. We fought Nazis, so whatever we did was justified. Others struggled with it their entire lives, feeling that killing is killing regardless of context, and both responses are valid because moral certainty in war is usually a luxury afforded to people who weren't there. If you're still with me this deep into the story, you're probably not here just for military history. You're here because you recognize that this is really about human nature under extreme pressure, about how good people can do terrible things for good reasons, about how institutions fail when they prioritize myth over reality, about how trauma shapes generations, and these themes are universal. Even if the specific context is historical, we're still dealing with institutional denial. We're still sending young people to do violence in the name of causes they didn't choose. We're still failing to care for them when they come home broken. And we're still pretending that better technology will somehow make war less traumatic when all it does is change how we distribute the trauma. The Firefly versus Tiger story is ultimately about the gap between how we think violence works and how it actually works. We imagine it's clean and decisive and morally simple. We build myths about technological superiority and warrior virtue. But the reality is messy and morally complex and psychologically devastating for everyone involved. The Canadians who operated Fireflies effectively were not superhuman. They were ordinary people who learned extraordinary skills out of necessity and paid extraordinary prices for those skills. The Germans who lost to them were not inferior. They were ordinary people trapped in a failing system that couldn't adapt fast enough to save them. And the real lesson isn't about tanks or tactics, but about what happens when institutional pride meets battlefield reality and human beings are caught in between. The final question, and this is the one that matters most, is what we owe the people who fought these battles, because saying "thank you for your service" is easy and insufficient. They don't need gratitude. They need understanding that what they experienced was fundamentally altering and can't be processed through normal peacetime frameworks. They need recognition that asking people to become efficient killers has consequences that persist long after the shooting stops. They need support systems that acknowledge trauma rather than dismissing it as weakness. And they need a society that's honest about what war actually costs, instead of hiding behind myths about glory and honor, because the gap between myth and reality is where suffering lives, and closing that gap might be the most meaningful way to honor what they went through. What Hitler's staff should have told him, what every leader should hear when sending people into violence, is that victory has a price beyond destroyed equipment and territory gained. It's paid in shattered psyches and broken relationships and generations dealing with inherited trauma, and that price should factor into every decision about whether to fight, how to fight, and when to stop fighting. But it rarely does, because acknowledging that price would make violence harder to justify. And institutions built on violence have strong incentives to maintain myths that make it seem noble and necessary and clean, when it's actually none of those things. The Firefly crews and Tiger crews were both victims of this mythology in different ways. The Canadians were told they were heroes and expected to be fine. The Germans were told they were villains and expected to disappear. But both groups were really just humans who'd experienced the worst of what humans do to each other and were trying to figure out how to keep living afterward. And society failed both groups by refusing to acknowledge the complexity of that experience. We want simple stories about good defeating evil, and the reality is that evil was defeated by people who did evil things for good reasons and were changed irrevocably by doing them. And that's the truth we need to face if we want to honor them honestly rather than using them as props for nationalist mythology. So here's where we end. The story of what happened when Canadian Fireflies started killing tigers at 1,800 yards is not really about tanks. It's about what happens when reality contradicts institutional myth, about the price of adaptation versus the cost of denial, about how ordinary people respond to extraordinary pressure, and about the long shadow that violence casts over everyone it touches. These lessons are as relevant today as they were in 1944 because human nature hasn't changed and institutional dynamics haven't changed. We're still building systems that prioritize comfort over truth, still sending people to do things that will damage them, still failing to care for them afterward, and still wondering why we can't seem to learn from history. But maybe we can start by acknowledging that history is made by humans, and humans are complex and contradictory and capable of both extraordinary courage and extraordinary cruelty, sometimes in the same moment. And holding that complexity without collapsing into simple narratives is hard but necessary if we want to actually understand what happened and why it matters. The crews are mostly gone now. The Firefly commanders and Tiger crews and everyone who experienced these battles firsthand. They took their complete truth with them, because you can't fully communicate what it's like to live through that kind of intensity. But they left behind fragments, letters and memoirs and official reports, and if we pay attention to what's between the lines, we can maybe get closer to understanding not just what they did, but what it cost them. And that understanding might make us more careful about when and why we ask people to bear those costs in the future, which would be a better memorial than any monument we could build.